You know, Daniel's little garage is adorable, my wife said, and the table laughed like she had just delivered the line of the night. I remember the sound more clearly than the music playing over the restaurant speakers, more clearly than the clink of silverware against white china, because Lauren laughed with them. That was the part that stayed with me. My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm 44 years old, and I live just outside Dayton, Ohio, in a two-story house with a narrow driveway and an 18 by 24-foot detached garage behind it. Nothing impressive from the street. Gray siding, one roll-up door, a faded workbench I built myself 15 years ago. Most mornings, I unlock that garage before sunrise, turn on the fluorescent lights, pour coffee from a scratched stainless steel thermos, and spend the next 10 hours surrounded by steel housings, servo drives, control boards, grease, wire, and the low electrical hum of machines most people wouldn't recognize. Lauren used to love that place. When we first bought the house, she would bring me coffee while I worked and sit on an upside-down 5-gallon bucket while I explained whatever I was rebuilding. Back then, she called my hands talented. Somewhere along the way, talented became dirty. Independent became unambitious. And my garage became something she mentioned with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. That Friday evening, Lauren came through the side door while I was leaning over a damaged servo controller shipped in from a plant 3 states away. She was already dressed for dinner, navy suit, pearl earrings, hair pinned neatly back, every inch the director of operations she had worked 12 years to become. She stopped just inside the doorway and looked around like she had accidentally walked into somebody else's life. "You're wearing that tonight?" she asked. I looked down at my work shirt. There was a dark streak of machine oil near the cuff. I was planning on changing. Good. She glanced at the controller on my bench. And maybe don't get into the whole garage thing with Graham. Graham Whitaker was the CEO of Merit Manufacturing Group, Lauren's company. 8 factories across the Midwest. Thousands of employees. The kind of company that put its name on convention centers and sponsored charity galas with 6-figure checks. I set my screwdriver down. The garage thing? Lauren exhaled through her nose. You know what I mean. I did. I just wanted to hear her say it. Are you embarrassed by what I do? She looked toward the driveway instead of at me. Daniel, tonight matters. These people think big. Acquisitions. Expansion. Automation. I don't want the conversation getting stuck on lawn mowers and old engines. I almost corrected her. I hadn't repaired a lawn mower in years. The machine on my bench cost more than her car. The company that sent it had flown 2 engineers to Ohio because nobody on their staff could isolate the fault. But I didn't explain any of that. I wiped my hands on a shop towel and said, "Got it." 2 hours later, we were seated in a private dining room downtown with Graham Whitaker, Merit CEO Kevin Shaw, 2 vice presidents, and their spouses. Lauren was glowing. She talked about production targets, expansion forecasts, and a new automation platform Merit planned to roll out across all 8 plants. I listened, mostly. Then Graham turned toward me. "So, Daniel, what line of work are you in?" I opened my mouth. Lauren answered first. "Daniel has a little garage behind the house." She smiled. "He likes keeping his hands busy." Kevin grinned. "A garage guy? Perfect. If one of our lawn mowers breaks, we know who to call." The table laughed. Graham gave a polite chuckle. One of the vice presidents raised his glass toward me. Lauren laughed too. Not nervously. Not apologetically. She laughed like I was part of the entertainment. I didn't argue. I didn't correct anyone. I took a sip of water and let the moment pass. Men learn something as they get older. Sometimes defending yourself only makes people more certain they have measured you correctly. So I let them measure me. Small garage. Dirty hands. Nothing important. Under the table, my phone vibrated once against my leg. I ignored it. Then it vibrated again. I glanced down. The message was from Bob Harlan, Merit's chief reliability engineer, a man Lauren had mentioned. Maybe twice in 10 years. There were only 2 sentences on the screen. Line 4 failed again. Same signature you warned about. I read it twice. Across the table, Lauren was telling Graham how confident she was about the upcoming 8-plant rollout. Everyone was smiling. Everyone except me. I locked my phone and placed it face down beside my plate. The laughter around that table suddenly sounded very far away. The drive home should have been quiet, but Lauren was still carrying the energy of the dinner with her. She talked about Graham Whitaker's expansion plans, Kevin Shaw's confidence in the new automation rollout, and the possibility that Merit might promote her to vice president of operations before the end of the year. I kept both hands on the steering wheel and watched Interstate 75 stretch ahead under the yellow wash of highway lights. My phone sat face down in the center console. I could still see Bob Harlan's message in my head. Line 4 failed again. Same signature you warned about. Lauren finally noticed I was not saying much. You could have tried a little harder tonight, she said. At what? Conversation. I glanced at her. I thought everyone was having a pretty good time. She caught the edge in my voice. Kevin was joking. I know. Then why are you acting like this? I let a few seconds pass. The tires hummed against the pavement. I'm not acting like anything. That answer irritated her more than an argument would have. Lauren preferred problems she could name, organize, and solve. Silence gave her nothing to work with. My phone vibrated again. This time I picked it up at the next red light. Bob had sent a diagnostic log. 47 pages of temperature readings, servo timing, network delays, and safety interlock events. Most people would have seen numbers. I saw a pattern. 3 values were drifting together when they should have been independent. That was not random. It was a warning. I called Bob through the truck's hands-free system. He answered on the first ring. Tell me they have not synchronized the other plants yet. Lauren turned toward me. Bob lowered his voice. They are scheduled to push the update Monday morning. Stop. It. Daniel, you know I do not have that authority. Then find someone who does. Lauren's expression tightened. What is this about? I held up one finger and kept listening. Bob explained that Line 4 at the Indiana facility had shut itself down twice during testing. Merritt's new Nexus 8 control package kept blaming sensor noise, but the shutdown sequence was too clean. I knew that sequence. I had written the logic behind its ancestor more than a decade earlier. Do not bypass the safety interlock, I said. I mean it, Bob. If Kevin tells them to force a restart, make sure your objection is documented. Bob went quiet. You think it is that serious? I watched the light turn green. I think you have a system telling you it does not trust its own timing. Believe it. I ended the call. Lauren stared at me like I had walked into one of her meetings uninvited. Why is our chief reliability engineer calling you? He asked me to look at something. Something from Merritt? Yes. Her posture changed. Not much. Just enough. Daniel, you cannot involve yourself in company operations because you overheard me talking about the rollout. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. I did not overhear anything. Bob sent me the logs. Why? Because he knows me. He knows you from where? There it was. Not curiosity. Disbelief. I turned onto our street. From before. Lauren folded her arms. Before what? I pulled into the driveway and shut off the engine. The garage stood 30 feet behind the house. One fluorescent light still glowing through the side window because I had forgotten to turn it off. Lauren followed my eyes. This is exactly what I mean, she said. You get one technical problem in front of you, and suddenly you think you understand what is happening inside a company with 8 factories. I looked at her. I understand enough to know they should delay Monday's rollout. Based on one log. Based on what the log is saying. She shook her head. Merritt has engineering teams, outside consultants, risk officers, and executives responsible for this. You fix machines in a garage. I run operations for $1 billion manufacturer. The words landed quietly. That made them heavier. I did not answer. I got out of the truck, walked toward the garage, and unlocked the side door. The smell of cutting oil and warm electronics met me like something familiar and honest. On my workbench sat the damaged servo controller from Pennsylvania. Beside it were 3 binders Lauren had never opened in all the years we had been married. I pulled the oldest one toward me and wiped dust from the cover. Sentinel Architecture, Revision 4. My name was printed beneath it. Daniel Reeves, Lead Systems Architect. I had not looked at that binder in years. My phone vibrated again. Bob. This time the message was shorter. Kevin approved the Monday rollout. All 8 plants. I stared at those words while the garage hummed around me. Then I opened the diagnostic log again and found the timing drift on page 17. It had gotten worse. Long before that garage became the place Lauren used to make my life sound small, I worked in buildings where the ceilings were 40 feet high and the machines never really slept. I was 29 when I joined Halstead Industrial Systems in Cincinnati, a company that built control architecture for automotive plants, packaging lines, steel processing facilities, and just about any operation where one bad signal could stop millions of dollars of equipment. Back then, I wore safety glasses more often than sunglasses and measured weeks by commissioning schedules instead of weekends. I liked the work because machines were honest. A sensor did not care about job titles. A motor did not care who sat at the head of a conference table. If something was wrong, the numbers eventually told you. My mentor was a reliability engineer named Walter Pierce, a quiet man with gray hair and a habit of carrying the same yellow legal pad everywhere. Walter taught me one rule before he taught me anything else. Never confuse running with safe. A machine could be moving and still be one bad decision away from shutting itself down. That lesson became personal during a commissioning project in Kentucky. We were testing a new automated transfer line when the system began producing timing discrepancies too small for the project managers to care about. Fractions of a second. Tiny drifts. Easy to dismiss. The schedule was already behind, and everyone wanted the line released. Walter did not. Neither did I. We pushed for another round of testing. That delay exposed a synchronization flaw between the primary controls and the emergency shutdown logic. Nothing dramatic happened because the system stopped exactly as it was designed to stop, but the lesson stayed with me. If we had ignored the warning, hundreds of workers would have spent their shifts around equipment nobody fully trusted. Walter looked at me afterward and tapped his legal pad against my shoulder. A good engineer gets the machine running, Daniel. A responsible one knows when it should not run. I carried that sentence into everything that came after. 3 years later, I led a small team developing what eventually became the Sentinel architecture, a layered control system designed to detect timing conflicts before they spread across linked equipment. Sentinel was not flashy. There were no magazine covers, no television interviews, no dramatic launch. It was redundancy, verification, independent safety logic, and thousands of hours spent asking one question over and over. What happens if this part lies? The system worked. Better than most of us expected. Manufacturers began licensing pieces of it. Other automation companies built their own platforms around principles we had documented. My name appeared on drawings, technical papers, and patent filings that Lauren never had any reason to read. She knew I was an engineer. She knew I traveled too much. That was enough in those days. When we married, she used to tease me about explaining control loops over dinner. I used to tease her about turning every vacation into a spreadsheet. We fit because neither of us needed the other person to be impressive. Then Halstead changed. New ownership, new executives, new promises to investors. They wanted a cheaper version of Sentinel that could be installed faster. The easiest way to make it cheaper was to remove redundancy. One verification layer became optional. Then another. Meetings that used to be about reliability became meetings about margins. I argued, politely at first, then constantly. The final disagreement came over a release I refused to approve. The redesigned system met the minimum requirements on paper, but I believed its protection logic depended too heavily on synchronized timing across components that could drift independently under real production loads. Management called the risk theoretical. I called it measurable. They wanted my signature because my name was attached to the original architecture. I would not give it. There was no shouting, no dramatic resignation speech. I placed my badge on a conference table, packed 2 boxes, and walked out on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was 32 years old. Lauren was waiting at home when I told her. She did not call me foolish. Not then. She wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and said, "If you could not sign it, you did the right thing." For years, I remembered that sentence whenever business was slow. I rented a small industrial bay first, then moved the work behind our house when consulting became steady. Companies began sending me the problems their own teams could not isolate. Failed drives, unstable networks, control systems that behaved perfectly until production reached full load. I never advertised much. I did not need to. Engineers talked to engineers. Bob Harlan was one of them. We met 9 years earlier at an Ohio plant where 3 consulting firms had blamed a recurring shutdown on defective sensors. It was not the sensors. It was clock drift across 2 controllers feeding contradictory data into the safety layer. I found it before lunch. Bob never forgot. Neither did I, standing alone in my garage that Friday night. I opened the old Sentinel binder and compared my original timing limits with the numbers Bob had sent from Merit. The difference was small, less than half a second. But small numbers had ended careers before. Small numbers had saved factories too. I turned another page and found the redundancy map from revision 4. Then I opened Merritt's diagnostic file beside it. One layer was missing. I checked again. Still missing. Somewhere between what Sentinel had been designed to do and what Nexus 8 was doing now, somebody had decided that protection was unnecessary. My phone lit up with another message from Bob. Final rollout meeting Monday, 7 in the morning. Lauren thinks we are ready. I stared at her name for a long time. Then I looked toward the dark house where my wife was already asleep. Years ago, she had trusted me enough to believe that refusing one signature could be an act of integrity. Now she trusted a corporate rollout more than the man who had helped design the rules underneath it. By Sunday evening, Merit Manufacturing had turned Monday morning into a deadline nobody wanted to question. Lauren spent most of the day at the dining room table with her laptop open, 2 phones beside her, and a legal pad covered in production numbers. I stayed in the garage. The distance between us was barely 40 feet, but it felt wider than it had in years. Around 4:30, Bob Harlan sent me the latest test summary from Indiana. The timing drift was still there. Worse, the engineering team had documented 3 protective shutdowns in less than 6 hours. None of them had damaged equipment. That was the good news. The bad news was that someone had classified all 3 as nuisance events. I read that phrase twice. Nuisance events. Engineers sometimes use clean words for uncomfortable facts. A shutdown sounds expensive. A nuisance sounds harmless. Change the label, and suddenly a warning becomes something management thinks it can schedule around. I called Bob. Who approved that classification? I asked. He hesitated. Operations Review Committee. Names. Another pause. Kevin chaired it. Lauren was there. I looked through the garage window toward the house. Lauren was still at the table, speaking into her headset. Did you object? In writing. Good. It did not matter. Bob sounded tired. He had spent 37 years keeping factories running, and I knew that tone. It was the sound of a man realizing the decision had moved beyond engineering. They are meeting at 7 tomorrow morning, he said. Final authorization. If they sign, the remaining sites synchronize at 8:30. 8 plants on 1 configuration. That is the plan. It is a bad plan. I know. After we ended the call, I printed the Indiana logs and placed them beside my old Sentinel diagrams. The evidence was not dramatic. That was what made it dangerous. Temperature stable. Voltage normal. Network traffic acceptable. Then, every few cycles, the clocks disagreed just enough for the safety layer to question what the system was telling it. The original Sentinel design expected that. Nexus 8 appeared to assume it would not happen. At 6:15, Lauren came into the garage carrying her laptop. She did not sit down. Were you talking to Bob again? Yes. Her mouth tightened. Daniel, I asked you not to interfere. I am not interfering. He asked for my opinion. And you gave him one that is making people nervous. I turned the printed log toward her. They should be nervous. She did not look at it. Kevin says the Indiana issue is sensor noise. Kevin is wrong. The vendor agrees with him. Then the vendor is wrong too. She gave a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. Do you hear yourself? Every word. Hundreds of people have worked on this rollout. That does not make the timing drift disappear. Lauren set her laptop on my bench. We have contracts tied to this launch. Customer commitments. Staffing plans. Shipping schedules. Delaying 8 plants because one system had a few protective stops would cost millions. Restarting 8 plants after the same failure would cost more. That finally made her glance at the paper. Her eyes moved across the numbers for maybe 3 seconds before she pushed it back. You do not have the full picture. I looked around the garage. Old binders. Diagnostic equipment. The steel workbench. 15 years of problems other people had brought me after the full picture failed them. Maybe not, I said. But I know what that pattern means. Lauren picked up her laptop. I have spent 3 years earning a seat in rooms where decisions like this get made. Then use the seat. She stopped. I kept my voice level. Asked them to delay. 48 hours. Run isolated tests. Confirm the clocks stay stable under full production load. And if you are wrong, then you lose. 2 days. And if we delay for nothing, Kevin will say I panicked because my husband scared me with an old engineering theory. There it was. Not safety. Not data. Reputation. Is that what this is about? I asked. Your promotion? Her face changed. Just slightly. Do not make this personal. I did not. She looked at me for a long moment, then walked back toward the house. Monday morning, I woke at 5:40 without an alarm. Rain tapped lightly against the bedroom window. Lauren was already gone. At 7:12, Bob texted me. Meeting started. At 7:41, another message arrived. Kevin approved. Graham approved. I stared at the screen, waiting. At 7:46, Bob sent the final line. Lauren signed the operational waiver. For a few seconds, the garage was completely still except for the faint hum of a power supply on my bench. I opened the old Sentinel binder and placed Lauren's name beside the timing chart I had marked in red pencil the night before. At 8:30, Merritt would begin synchronizing the rollout across all 8 factories. I checked the clock. It was 7:52. 38 minutes remained. At 8:29 Monday morning, I was standing in the garage with a cup of coffee going cold beside my keyboard when Bob Harlan sent 3 words. They are starting. I looked at the clock mounted above the workbench. 1 minute later, Merritt Manufacturing pushed the Nexus 8 configuration across all 8 factories. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. That was the dangerous part. Systems do not always fail loudly. Sometimes they smile at you first. Bob sent a screenshot from the Indiana plant. Production normal. Michigan reported normal. Ohio normal. Wisconsin normal. I could imagine the conference room at Merritt headquarters relaxing one person at a time. Kevin Shaw probably leaning back in his chair. Graham Whitaker probably checking his watch. Lauren probably telling herself that I had worried over nothing. At 8:43, Bob called. Indiana just logged another timing deviation. I opened the diagnostic feed he had given me access to. How much? 214 milliseconds. That is worse than Friday. I know. Tell them not to reset anything manually. Kevin already asked why the line slowed. My jaw tightened. What did you tell him? That the safety controller is compensating. I watched the values move across my screen. 2 clocks were drifting apart, correcting, then drifting again. Like 2 people carrying the same table while slowly walking in different directions. For another 6 minutes, the system kept itself balanced. Then Indiana stopped. No alarms screaming through my garage. No dramatic explosion. Just one status box on Bob's dashboard changing from green to red. Protective shutdown. Line 4 first. Then line 3. Then the rest of the assembly section. Bob stopped talking for a second. Indiana is down. I already knew. Do not bypass it. I am telling them. At 8:58, Michigan reported a synchronization fault. At 9:03, Wisconsin logged the same signature. My coffee sat untouched. The rain outside had stopped, but water still slid from the garage roof in slow drops. Every few seconds, another message appeared. Production suspended. Safety stayed active. Restart unsuccessful. At 9:11, Michigan went down. 9:17, Wisconsin. 9:24, the Ohio facility outside Columbus stopped 2 packaging lines. I leaned closer to the screen. The pattern was spreading exactly the way I had feared, not because one factory was infecting another, but because every plant was running the same flawed assumptions under slightly different loads. 8 copies of the same mistake. At 9:30, Lauren called me. I let it ring twice before answering. Daniel. Her voice was different now. The polished certainty from Sunday was gone. Behind her, I could hear people talking over one another. How bad is this? She asked. How many plants? 4 affected. 3 fully down or partially down. She exhaled. Kevin says the vendor can force a restart. Do not let them. They say the interlocks are being overly sensitive. They are doing their job. We have shipments scheduled today. Then reschedule them. Silence. Daniel, we are losing money every minute. You will lose more if someone disables a protection system they do not understand. She lowered her voice. Can you tell me what is happening? I looked at the old Sentinel diagram beside my laptop. The new system is depending on synchronized timing that the hardware cannot guarantee under full production load. When the clocks drift far enough apart, the safety layer stops trusting the data. Can it be fixed? Yes. How fast? That depends on what they changed. Before she could answer, another notification appeared. Minnesota plant. Protective shutdown. I said nothing. Lauren must have heard the pause. What? 5. Her breathing changed. 5 plants. Yes. At 9:47, number 6 stopped. By 10:15, 7 factories had reported major production interruptions. The 8th, a newer facility in Illinois, was still running, but its timing values were moving in the same direction. Bob sent me a message. Corporate wants everyone in emergency operations. Vendor engineers are joining remotely. I typed back one sentence. Keep the Illinois plant under reduced load. 10 seconds later, Bob replied. Kevin refused. At 10:22, Illinois crossed the same timing threshold. The safety system reacted. Green became yellow. Yellow became red. All 8. I leaned back from the workbench and listened to the fluorescent lights hum above me. At Merit headquarters, thousands of production decisions were probably being rewritten by the minute. Trucks would wait at loading docks. Supervisors would send crews to alternate tasks. Customers would start calling. But the people inside those factories were safe because the system had chosen to stop rather than pretend everything was fine. That mattered more to me than any quarterly number. At 10:36, Bob called again. His voice was almost a whisper. They brought in the vendor, 2 outside automation firms, and a consulting team from Chicago. Good. None of them will authorize a full restart. I looked at the clock. Good. Bob paused. Graham wants to know who designed the original protection logic. My eyes moved toward the Sentinel binder. What did you tell him? I told him I would show him. Then Bob added, Lauren is in the room. I closed my eyes for 1 second. Not from anger. From recognition. The moment I had hoped would never come had finally arrived. Somewhere inside Merit headquarters, Bob Harlan was about to place an old engineering drawing on a conference table. And at the bottom of that drawing was my name. At Merit headquarters, Bob Harlan laid the old Sentinel drawing across the conference table while the room was still arguing about restart procedures. Graham Whitaker stopped talking first. Kevin Shaw leaned forward. Lauren did not move. Bob placed one finger near the bottom corner of the page, where the original design credits were printed in plain black letters. Daniel Reeves, lead systems architect. Graham looked from the drawing to Lauren. Reeves, he asked. She stared at my name as if the letters had rearranged themselves. Bob answered for her. Her husband. The room went quiet. Later, Bob told me that Kevin was the first person to object. He said there had to be another Daniel Reeves. Bob opened a second document. Then a third. Technical papers. Patent references. Reliability reviews. My name kept appearing. Graham finally asked the question that should have been asked before the rollout. Why was none of this in our vendor assessment? Bob looked directly at Kevin. Because the vendor licensed the architecture years after Daniel left Halstead. They know the framework. They do not know why every protection layer was put there. Lauren finally spoke. Daniel never told me any of this. Bob answered calmly. You never asked. That sentence reached me later, but it landed harder than I expected. At 11:12, Graham called my phone personally. I knew his voice from dinner. It sounded different without a restaurant full of people around him. Daniel, this is Graham Whitaker. I know. A pause. I have been looking at some old engineering documents. Then you know why the plant stopped. I know enough to understand we have a serious problem. You had a serious problem before 8:30. Now you have 8 stopped factories. He did not argue. That earned him more respect from me than anything he had said Friday night. Can you come downtown? He asked. I looked around. The garage. My old drawings were spread across the workbench. Bob's live diagnostic feed still showed 8 red status indicators. No. Another pause. Daniel, we can send a car. That is not the issue. Then what is? Your teams are at headquarters. The machines are not. I told him I needed raw controller logs, hardware revision numbers, network maps, and access to the Indiana test archive before I walked into any Merit facility. Graham asked how quickly I could review everything. Send it now. The first files arrived 12 minutes later. By noon, my workbench looked like it had 15 years earlier. 2 laptops open. Printed diagrams stacked beside a multimeter. Coffee forgotten. Numbers everywhere. At 12:48, I found the first confirmation. Nexus 8 had removed an independent timing verification path that Sentinel used to compare clock drift before the primary controls trusted production data. At 1:16, I found the second. The vendor had replaced another hardware check with software averaging. Cheaper, faster, cleaner on paper, less forgiving in the real world. At 1:32, I sent Graham a single message. Do not restart anything. At 2:10, a dark sedan turned into my driveway. I heard the tires before I looked up. Graham Whitaker stepped out wearing the same kind of suit he had worn at dinner, but there was no audience now. Lauren got out from the passenger side. She looked toward the garage door and then at me standing behind the workbench in an old gray shirt with my sleeves rolled up. For a second, none of us spoke. The place probably looked even smaller to her than it had Friday. 18 feet wide, 24 feet deep. Steel shelves, old cabinets, one stained concrete floor. Graham walked inside slowly, his eyes moving over the binders, control boards, diagnostic equipment, and technical drawings covering the walls. He stopped at the Sentinel binder. You designed this? I led the team. He nodded once. No disbelief. No joke. Bob says you are the only person he trusts to rebuild the protection sequence without creating another problem. Bob is being generous. He is not a generous man. I almost smiled. Lauren stayed near the doorway. She had not said a word. Graham removed his jacket and folded it over one arm. It was a small gesture, but I understood it. He was no longer visiting someone beneath him. He was entering someone else's workplace. Daniel, he said, I need your help. I waited. He looked at the 8 red plant indicators on my screen. I need you to get every one of those factories running again. I looked past him at Lauren. Friday night. She had laughed when Kevin called me the man to contact if Merritt ever needed a lawnmower repaired. Now her chief executive officer was standing on the same concrete floor she had dismissed, asking me to solve the largest operational failure in the company's history. I felt no satisfaction. Only wait. Thousands of workers were waiting. Customers were waiting. 8 plants were silent. I will help, I said. Graham exhaled. Lauren closed her eyes for half a second. I raised one hand. But not under your current rules. Graham studied me. What rules? I turned the laptop toward him. 8 red lights filled the screen. The rules that put all 8 of those there. Graham looked at the 8 red indicators, then back at me. Tell me what you need. I folded my arms and kept my voice level. First, safety gets final authority. If a protection system stops a line, nobody overrides it because a shipment is late or a customer is angry. Second, no engineer gets blamed for documenting a warning. Bob raised concerns. His team raised concerns. They stay protected. Third, I get complete access to every controller log, every configuration change, every vendor note, and every approval record tied to Nexus 8. Nothing filtered through management. Nothing cleaned up for presentation. Graham nodded slowly. And the fourth, if I find out this happened because someone ignored documented risk, the board receives exactly what I find. Lauren shifted near the doorway. Graham noticed. So did I? He did not look away from me. Agreed. Not verbally. I pushed a yellow legal pad across the bench. Put it in writing. 10 minutes later, Graham Whitaker signed his name beneath all 4 conditions. I took a picture, sent a copy to Bob, and grabbed my old field bag from the cabinet. Lauren finally spoke. Where are you going? Indiana. Tonight. The first failure started there. That is where the cleanest data will be. Graham checked his watch. It was almost 3 in the afternoon. Company jet can have you there in 90 minutes. I shook my head. Dayton to the plant is less than 200 miles. I will drive. Lauren looked at my 12-year-old pickup parked outside. Daniel, this is not the time to prove a point. I am not proving anything. My equipment is already in the truck. The drive west was gray and quiet. Bob called twice with updates. Merritt's consultants had developed 3 restart proposals. All 3 required temporarily disabling at least one protection layer. I rejected all 3 before I reached the state line. When I arrived at the Indiana facility shortly after 6, the parking lot was fuller than usual, but the plant itself felt strangely still. A factory designed to move thousands of components every hour has a particular sound when it is healthy. Motors, conveyors, ventilation, forklifts, compressors. That evening, most of those sounds were missing. Inside the control room, 12 people were staring at screens. 2 vendor engineers recognized my name before they recognized my face. Kevin Shaw recognized neither. He looked at my work jacket, then at Graham, who had arrived ahead of me by air. This is the consultant? Kevin asked. Graham answered before I could. This is the man running recovery. Kevin started to object. Graham raised one hand. Not tonight. I sat beside the lead controls engineer and opened the raw logs. The first problem appeared within 20 minutes. The primary controller was correcting its internal clock every few seconds. The secondary unit was correcting at a different interval. Under light load, the difference stayed small. Under full production, network traffic increased, correction packets arrived late, and the 2 systems slowly stopped agreeing about when events had happened. That is why line 4 failed first, I said. Bob leaned over my shoulder. Highest cycle rate in the plant. Exactly. At 7:12, we isolated line 4 from the synchronized clock service and restored the independent verification path using hardware already installed in the cabinet but disabled by the Nexus configuration. At 7:46, we ran the line at 25% load. Stable. 50%. Stable. 75. Still stable. Kevin stood behind us with his arms crossed. Take it to full. I shook my head. Not yet. We are already hours behind. Then another 30 minutes will not change your quarter. He looked toward Graham. Graham said nothing. Safety had final authority now. At 8:21, after 3 clean test cycles, I approved full production. The line started. One machine, then another, then another. The sound traveled through the building in stages until the floor carried that familiar low vibration again. Bob watched the timing graph. Flat. No drift. At 8:53, the entire Indiana plant returned to controlled production. Nobody cheered. Professionals rarely do when a machine begins doing what it was always supposed to do. But shoulders dropped. People breathed differently. Coffee cups came off desks. The room felt alive again. Michigan was next. Their configuration was similar, but not identical. We worked remotely with their engineering team until after midnight, restoring the missing verification layer and testing each production section separately. At 1:18 Tuesday morning, Michigan turned green. Wisconsin followed at 3:47. 3 factories running. 5 still dark. I had been awake nearly 22 hours when Lauren placed a paper cup of coffee beside me. You were right, she said quietly. I kept my eyes on the Wisconsin timing graph. This is not about being right. I know. I finally looked at her. She seemed smaller without the conference table, the title, the certainty. Do you? She did not answer. At 4:11, Bob opened the master change history for Nexus 8. Thousands of entries filled the screen. Software revisions. Hardware substitutions. Cost reductions. Approval codes. I searched for the exact date the independent verification layer had been removed. One record appeared. Then another. Then a third. Bob leaned closer. Daniel. I saw it too. The change had not come from the vendor alone. Merit management had requested it after a cost review 6 months earlier. There was an approval chain attached. Kevin Shaw. Graham Whitaker. Operations Committee. I stared at the final authorization field, but the name was hidden behind an archived reference number. Open that, I said. Bob clicked the record. The system loaded slowly. Lauren was standing 6 feet behind me when the final approval document appeared. Lauren's name appeared at the bottom of the approval document, not buried in a distribution list, not copied for awareness. Final operational authorization. Lauren Reeves, Director of Operations. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. The control room was filled with the low hum of computers and the distant rhythm of the production lines we had already restored, but all I could hear was the memory of her voice in our garage. You do not have the full picture. I read the document again. 6 months earlier, Merit had been trying to reduce the cost of the Nexus 8 rollout. The vendor proposed removing the independent verification hardware from new installations and disabling it where older equipment already had it. The projected savings were substantial. Installation time would drop. Maintenance would be simpler. The risk report attached to the proposal was less comforting. Bob's engineering group had flagged the change as conditionally acceptable only if every plant completed extended load testing before synchronization. That testing had never happened. Kevin had pushed for the schedule. Graham had accepted the financial case. And Lauren had signed the final operational waiver that allowed the rollout to move forward without the full test cycle. Bob turned away from the monitor. He did not need to say anything. Graham stood behind us, reading over my shoulder. Kevin was suddenly interested in the floor. Lauren remained 6 feet away, holding the same untouched cup of coffee she had brought me minutes earlier. Daniel, she said. I raised one hand. Not yet. My voice was quiet. Steady. I opened the supporting documents one by one. I needed facts before feelings. That was something Walter had taught me years ago. When a system fails, do not argue with the alarm. Find the sequence. The sequence was clear. Engineering warned them. Management wanted speed. The vendor offered a cheaper path. The safety margin narrowed. Then somebody had to sign. Lauren did. Graham finally spoke. We will address accountability after recovery. I nodded. Good. We still have 5 plants down. That was the moment I understood something about anger. It can feel powerful, but responsibility is heavier. I could have stopped. I could have walked out and let Merit explain the consequences of its own decisions. But there were thousands of people whose paychecks depended on those plants, and none of them had signed that waiver. So I went back to work. Ohio came online shortly after 6 in the morning. Minnesota followed before 9. Illinois gave us trouble because its newer controllers used a different firmware revision, but by early afternoon, we had restored the verification path and stabilized the timing. 4 plants remained, then 3, then 2. Lauren stayed near the recovery team without trying to speak to me again. She carried files. She answered questions. She stopped defending the rollout. Somewhere around noon, she removed her blazer and rolled up her sleeves. It was the first time in years I had seen her look less like an executive and more like the woman who used to sit on a bucket in my garage drinking coffee while I worked. That memory hurt more than the document. By Tuesday evening, 7 plants were running. The final facility, a large assembly operation in Missouri, had a configuration nobody had documented correctly. We spent nearly 5 hours tracing differences between the installed hardware and the corporate records. At 10:37, I found a secondary clock module buried in an old cabinet that had never been included in the Nexus upgrade map. We brought it into the verification loop, ran 3 controlled tests, and watched the timing graph flatten. At 11:19, I authorized the restart. Machines came online section by section. Green indicators replaced red across the master dashboard. 8 factories, running safely. Bob leaned back and rubbed both hands over his face. Graham thanked the engineers in the room. Nobody made a speech. Nobody needed one. I packed my notes into my field bag. Lauren followed me into a quiet conference room near the plant floor. I should have listened to you, she said. You should have listened to Bob. She looked down. I thought the risk was acceptable. I set the approval document on the table between us. Did you? Her eyes lifted toward mine. Kevin said the delay could cost us the quarter. Graham wanted the rollout. The vendor said the safeguards were conservative. That is not what I asked. She went silent. I waited. Finally, she said, the vice president position was going to be decided after the rollout. There it was. Small. Clean. Honest. So you signed because you wanted the promotion. I believed the system would work. And the promotion made believing easier. Her face tightened, but she did not argue. I was grateful for that. I looked through the glass wall at the factory floor, where people were returning to normal work under bright overhead lights. Friday night. You laughed because you thought my world was small. She closed her eyes for a second. Daniel, I am sorry. The garage was never the problem, Lauren. I picked up the paper. The problem was that somewhere along the way, you decided a title made your judgment bigger than everyone else's. She looked at me. The board investigation began before I made it back to Ohio. Graham kept his promise. Every log, every warning, every approval, and every change request went into the record exactly as they had existed before anyone knew the factories would stop. 3 days later, Kevin Shaw was removed from operations pending review. 2 weeks after that, Merritt announced that he would not be returning. Graham did not escape responsibility either. He had approved the financial strategy that pushed Nexus 8 forward, and the board made that clear. By the end of the month, he stepped down as chief executive officer. I respected him more for accepting that than I ever had for the title he carried. Lauren's case was harder. She had not designed the flawed changes. She had not ordered engineers to hide anything. But her signature was there, and so was the warning she had chosen to accept. Merritt reassigned her while the board reviewed the operational process. The vice president position disappeared before anyone formally told her she had lost it. I did not celebrate. There was nothing satisfying about watching a person you had loved for years discover that ambition could become a blindfold. When I finally returned home, the garage looked exactly the same. Same gray siding. Same stained concrete. Same fluorescent lights humming above the workbench. I stood in the doorway for a while before turning anything on. After 2 days surrounded by giant factories and conference rooms full of executives, the place felt almost peaceful. Small, yes. But small is not the same as insignificant. Lauren came home that evening around 7. She found me replacing a worn connector on the Pennsylvania servo controller I had abandoned before everything started. For several minutes, she just stood near the workbench. No suit jacket, no phone in her hand, no corporate language between us. They reassigned me, she said. I heard. For now, I am supporting compliance reviews. I nodded. She looked around the garage. Her eyes stopped on the Sentinel binders. I used to sit right there. She pointed toward an old 5-gallon bucket pushed beneath a shelf. You did. I used to think this place was amazing. I kept working. What changed? She took time before answering. I did. That was probably the most honest thing she had said in years. She stepped closer. I kept telling myself I was growing. That wanting more meant I was becoming better. Bigger office. Bigger title. Bigger decisions. She looked at the shelves. Then I started measuring everybody else the same way. I set the connector down. Including me. Especially you. Her voice softened. Because you did not seem to want any of it. I wanted useful work. I know that now. I looked at her. You knew it before. That hurt her. I could see it. But she nodded. You are right. We stood there with 20 years of memories between us, and no clean way to sort them. She apologized again. Not for the factories. Not for the signature. For the dinner. For laughing. For making the person beside her smaller, so she could feel larger in the room. That apology mattered. It just did not erase what had happened. I need some space, I told her. She looked down, then back at me. Are you leaving? For a while. I rented a small apartment 10 minutes from the house. We did not make dramatic announcements. We did not turn our marriage into a public trial. We separated because sometimes respect needs silence before anyone can tell whether it can grow back. Merit changed too. Bob was promoted to oversee reliability standards across all 8 plants. Every major control modification now required independent load testing and documented engineering approval. The company asked me to join full-time. I declined. Then they offered a consulting contract. I accepted that, with conditions. 6 months later, I changed the sign outside my garage. Reeves Reliability Lab. Nothing fancy. Black letters on white metal. I hired 2 younger engineers and kept the team small on purpose. We worked on difficult problems for manufacturers across the country, but I refused to turn the place into something I had spent years walking away from. One afternoon, almost a year after the shutdown, Lauren stopped by. We were civil by then. Better than civil, maybe. Honest. She stood beneath the new sign and smiled. Still a small garage. I looked at the 18-foot wall, the old workbench, the coffee maker that had survived everything. You measured the walls, I said. She looked at me. I nodded toward a framed photograph hanging above the bench. It showed workers from Merit's 8 factories STA,